Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Belladonna of Sadness. I had never heard of Belladonna of Sadness until today, and it's a very rare Japanese animated film, and when I'd read about there's this X-rated, erotic, strange, psychedelic Japanese movie I had never heard of that was finally getting released in America, I was instantly interested, because although there are a lot of animated films that play at the art house, they're not necessarily art house movies. I've talked about this before in reviews of things like April in the Extraordinary World, where it's just like, yes, that could probably play it like in AMC theaters and, you know, a normal mainstream audience would accept it, but instead, because they won't play a French cartoon just simply because it's French, it plays at the art house. But Belladonna of the Sadness is very much an art house movie. It's a crazy erotic art house film. A huge financial disaster when it was released, only released in Japan and semi throughout Europe, and actually only right now is getting its biggest US release ever. It was like briefly played in the US, apparently semi a couple times in the 70s at festivals from what I've read, and then a few times in 2009, but now it's really getting a full release where it's playing in theaters, one in New York and one in LA. Belladonna of Sadness is a unique film from the 70s, a decade known for its unique crazy films, and was part of the end of the Mushi Animation Studio, or Mushi Productions. It was actually their last film that put them into bankruptcy and ruined the whole studio, and it's actually came out at an interesting time of animation when you're starting to have people like Ralph Bakshi, when they're starting to have released more adult animated films, like X-rated animated film. This came out a year after Fritz the Cat. It was really seeing the sea change of the 70s and kind of this explosion of more adult animation, but unfortunately it was like too weird and strange and arty for the kind of more grindhouse, dirtier theaters that normally would take something like this, and it was too weird, strange, and sexual for the actual art houses at the time. So Belladonna of Sadness, like most of animation, got left out of film history and actually completely forgotten until this re-release. And it is quite an interesting, odd, psychedelic animation experience like no other. It feels like you're looking at something from a strange, erotic Japanese graphic novel that you found in the woods, and you're afraid someone's gonna walk in on you looking at and scream that you're a pervert, but it also looks like some of the most beautiful psychedelic watercolors you'd ever seen. And that's all mixed together with a major film about feminism, Joan of Arc, and witchcraft all come together to a crazy, insane movie called Belladonna of Sadness. Jeannie and Jean, who are happily married, and go to the local baron to get his blessing, and of course he wants a tax on their wedding, and wants a tax of what is worth about 10 farm cows because of their marriage, and unfortunately they can't pay it, and Jean, the husband in this case, begs the baron for them not to have to pay that, and the baron comes up with the idea that they're going to rape the ever-living fuck out of his wife right in front of him, and have like the whole castle that the baron lives in do it. And if you think that's an exaggeration, it's not, and it's shown in a very graphic, crazy, beautiful, upsetting, and disturbing scene that you'll probably not forget. And they kick Jean out of the castle where literally this isn't an exaggeration, they raped the fucking shit out of her for like the whole night. This is the plot of the movie. I mean, they don't say they raped the shit out of her, the fucking shit out of her, but I mean, it's awful, it's horrible. They literally rape her a lot. It is a gang rape. So then she comes out of that all just destroyed, her clothes ripped, breasts exposed, just like completely a shell of her former self, and comes back to her home with Jean, and they cry, and she's very obviously upset because of what has just happened to her. And then after Jean falls asleep and Jeannie is still awake, obviously, from going through probably the worst things anyone could ever do to a person, she sees a phallic little spirit who encourages her to get power against the baron and make her revenge, and suddenly the couple's fortunes start to rise. I'm assuming, they don't really give a specific time, but I'm assuming it's during kind of the Middle Ages, during that time period. It's Japanese, but it takes place in Europe, but it's very Japanese, so I don't know. But then fortunes start to change because of her deal with this little spirit who keeps growing and growing. He's like this phallic type spirit, and then she eventually gets powers and becomes a witch from the devil, who is kind of related to this spirit, and starts growing within her power, helping out the village and distancing herself more and more from Jean as she becomes more and more of a witch and becomes more and more powerful, as many times the baron tries to either rape her or tear her down, or the people try to tear her down. She comes back even more powerful and even more influential on the people, an even more resilient woman than anyone thought she could ever be, especially after the horrible treatment that she has been put through. So this is the third in the Anime-rama trilogy after 101 Arabian Nights and Cleopatra. This is the third entry. I have not seen the other two. The one before it, they tried to consider it the first X-rated cartoon cartoon, but it actually was not rated by the MPAA. They just self-appointed it next, which is weird. These were kind of notorious for being more erotic, more scandalous, more pushing the boundaries than Moshi Animation had done before. And this was actually the animation director and manga artist Osamu Tezuka, who created things like Astro Boy and Kimba the White Lion, was very synonymous with this studio, but he had actually decided to leave at this point. And of the Animorama trilogy, this is like a whole bunch of me not saying shit right, this is the only one that he did not direct. And it ended up being the end of the studio because they kind of pushed the boundaries far too much. The Animorama trilogy came along maybe at the right time, but I think it went even farther artistically than even the time was ready for. If you look at the things like what Ralph Bakshi did, they had kind of a mainstream ideal of what people wanted from an animated film. I mean, Fritz the Cat is still weird and strange, but a mainstream audience could get with it. Same with like Heavy Metal, Wizards, Fire and Ice. These are more mainstream things. Belladonna of Sadness is not like that at all. It has an interesting, odd kind of sense to its animation. It feels very much like early Japanese animated films, which I cannot think of. I actually really try to look up what the name of this animation is. It's more limited and you use a lot of just like stills. And I guess the most recent example I can think of was the Max, and even they couldn't come up with the actual term. They just said it's limited early Japanese animation. I'm curious if there is a term for it. It's basically done, or according to the people who worked on the Max, who kind of isolate certain emotions and just play off those particular emotions in the scene, which I think Belladonna of Sadness does particularly well, because you really understand her perspectives through a lot of it, through her poses, through beautiful watercolor pictures of her or beautiful illustrations. You really get her emotion through the scene, because a lot of these scenes you just get the pure isolated emotion. You don't get really a lot of complications as you had if the scene would be moving. You don't get as many moments. You're kind of like almost so much more even controlled and manipulated in a much more stronger way than you would in typical filmmaking. And I think Belladonna of the Sadness uses that very, very well and goes with the ebbs and flows with that style better than I've seen anyone do other than the Max. I think the Max is a little more watchable and mainstream. This is just like confusing and weird and strange. I mean, it's really like going into a world you never knew existed and just kind of having to be really cool with it. A lot of people compare it to taking acid. I'm just gonna say that I think when people do that, it's kind of some of the lamest critic pull quoting, but it is kind of psychedelic strange and trying to be drug trippy on purpose. So I guess in this case it is true, but acid's not really like that. But the point being, Belladonna of Sadness is a beautiful use of that kind of animation. I really liked it, and I think it shows the artistic step forwards that they were making. And although you had great animation happening in Japan with people like Topcraft, and they were very, very skilled, these guys were going in a completely different direction, which ended up putting them completely out of business. And it barely played in Japan and Europe because they just didn't have the money to promote it, and it played in film festivals and such, but I don't think other than an odd showing here or there really played in America that much. And it is weird starting this movie off, and they don't really advertise it having more limited animation. You could also see that animation, those like crappier, like, which actually Ralph Bakshi worked on as well, those Spider-Man cartoons from the 60s or the Marvel cartoons from the early 60s, which Belladonna of the Sadness really gets the surreal element of that and lets you kind of alone with your thoughts in an art movie way, which depending on how your thoughts were before you step into the movie could be a good or bad thing. One of the things that struck me the most about this film, and this film is based on a book, Satanism and Witchcraft by Jules Michelet, which is based on the witch trials in Europe, which were actually way fucking worse than the American one, but you never hear about it. It kind of bugs me that we don't, but they were pretty horrific. This is semi-based on the idea of kind of Joan of Arc and all these things, but it really has a lot to do with the witch trials, and the whole idea of a witch is really a woman claiming her independence. It's really anti-feminist, the whole idea of witch trials, and the whole thing with Jeannie, and every time she kind of rises herself up from being horribly raped and torn apart by these guys, and this film doesn't shy from that at all and what it does to a person, but what she does is she's so resilient. I actually think this should be called Belladonna of Resilience. But one thing I love about what would be considered women's pictures in classic Hollywood, or any story that's main protagonist is female, is usually there's this story of resilience, which I don't really get from more masculine stories. I notice if there is a story of resilience, they're all like kind of fucked up and like not as like resilient and not as powerful in a way. I've noticed through stories with female protagonists, they come through it more powerful than they were before, as better people. And I almost find more power from that that than I do from particularly male-centric stories that do almost the same thing, because there's almost so much more she's fighting against. I mean, she's fighting against so much. I mean, if she talks out of turn, they're gonna rape her, they're gonna tear her clothes off, her husband rejects her, society rejects her, the only one who will go with her is the devil. And to be honest, that maybe seems like the more enlightened path sometimes for her to take. It brings into question a lot of this morality. Sure, you could get really high and just watch the crazy visuals and ignore all of feminism, which, you know, a lot of people do in general. You could probably get something like that from any movie with trippy visuals if you just got super high with. And you could do that with this, and I think this would also be an awesome movie to have on at a party and be like, whoa, this is really cool. But if you really sit down with it, and it is a very much harder to watch animated film than I think with most, it shows resilience to femininity that I don't think a lot of features show as well, and kind of showing an older version of that. Obviously, it's based on a much older book. Satanism and Witchcraft was published in the 1800s, so it's reflecting a story from long ago, but it's using all this psychedelic imagery. So it's a lot of different things coming together. It's very much using that postmodern idea of taking a lot of postmodern ideas, but it's taking a modern thing and combining it with a very old thing. And a lot of this apparently does have to do with that women in Japan were fighting for equal rights and a lot of rights for women at the time. And I can absolutely not speak on that at all because I know so little about Japanese history beyond like the broad strokes of things. So I can't read into that as much, but a lot of this has to do with feminist ideas and rising up. And even though you are literally or figuratively beaten down, and I think honestly that's something I can always relate to, because as much as you get knocked down by life, as much as different ideas and people tell you you can't do things, you shouldn't crumble at them and hopefully make, 2 steps forward. You should make 100 steps forward and kick them in the fucking face, and then learn witchcraft and sign a deal with the devil and be way cooler than that person, and that person can sign a deal with God and watch Touched by an Angel or some shit, and you're like having an awesome orgy party where everybody's cured of the Black Plague or something. To me, the devil doesn't sound so bad under those circumstances, frankly. She almost is attacked more for having more ideas and being a woman, and I think this film takes that on. Certainly a film like The Witch took that on quite well, but I think that's really what this film is about, is that Witchcraft was more about these women having their own thoughts, having independence from the natural order of things. That still happens now. People don't get burned at the stake, but people are going to object to you from breaking apart from their natural idea of things, their natural idea of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And Belladonna of Sadness, she keeps going and she keeps going further and further. As much as they reject her, it feels like she gets more powerful and different. And in a way, I felt inspired by that story, but watching it, it is a strange concoction of a movie that you can't believe you're watching. It is crazy, it is erotic, it feels wrong, it feels right, it feels strange, and it feels weird. It feels like the style of Yellow Submarine if they really didn't give a fuck about anybody ever liking it. It's not a movie that cares if a mainstream audience gets it. I think because it came along at the early 70s, and maybe people would be ready for an animated film like this now, but honestly that's not true, because I don't think animation has really crossed over to the art movie divide as well as we probably would like to admit, and there's not those strange slow art films that really inhabit art theaters for animation. Unfortunately, we just have things that are basically films that could play in a multiplex. It's just they're in another language, so we might as well put them there. But Belladonna of Sadness is a genuine, beautiful, strange art movie. If you're a real lover of cinema and want to watch a really weird find that you can't believe happened, I mean, I didn't know about the Anamarama trilogy before, and I'd actually like to see the other ones, but I found this such a beautiful, strange, odd movie. And sure, Belladonna of Sadness sounds like some middle school girl's fantasy novel about why her parents will never let her leave her room, but it's a really beautiful, interesting find of a movie. I like the whole re-release culture of the time of re-releasing strange, odd, interesting cult movies that have never really gotten the support they honestly deserve and need that support to be discovered, but this is especially one that really absolutely needed it. And as much as I've talked at length about how animation really needs to be respected a lot more, I think this pushes the medium in strange ways that nobody is really ready to take it in. Belladonna of Sadness is the kind of animated film that we need more of to push the medium into more of a stranger, odd, erotic, feminist place that most people probably wouldn't dare, and if they do see, they'll probably be shocked and frightened by. And I think that makes it a one-of-a-kind, interesting, odd experience, even if it is a hard, strange art movie to get through. So if you have seen Belladonna of Sadness and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.